The Order of the Temple of Solomon had been founded in the aftermath of the First Crusade, a Christian military expedition which had captured Jerusalem from the Muslims. The first Templars had dedicated their lives to God by protecting pilgrims, but the order had soon proved itself to be the most effective military unit in the crusading army. At the Horns of Hattin, the Templar Knights had been singled out by Saladin and almost eliminated from the Holy Land. But in their short 60-year existence, the Templars had constructed an enormous support network throughout Western Europe that provided the front line with men and supplies. In fact, this elite military unit had created for itself the world's first multinational corporation. Since the Order of the Temple had first been established early in the 12th century, it had set out to attract recruits and raise funds. Although an individual knight could own nothing, he still needed horses, weaponry, and servants if he was to carry out God's work effectively. The King of Jerusalem had initially aided the Templars. Among the many reasons for doing so was the knowledge that visiting pilgrims brought much-needed income to the fledgling Crusader states. Pilgrims required food and lodgings, they paid road tolls, and they brought gifts. From the very beginning, the Templars were entirely comfortable with the economic realities of serving God in the Holy Land. The Templar Corporation, or network, began in Western Europe, built up from gifts of land donated by men and women who wanted to protect their immortal souls by supporting the Crusaders in the Holy Land. Many of the earliest donations received by the Templars were from men who wanted to join the order themselves. One of the most substantial donors came from Champagne, in northern France.
Hugh, Count of Champagne, joined the order in the 1120s, and he was one of its earliest important patrons. But once he joined the order, he lost the status that came with being an important territorial ruler. He had to abrogate his own will to that of the master, and he had to live the life of an ordinary knight. So one gave up a considerable amount in terms of status and in material comfort in order to become a Templar. But if you sincerely believe that what really matters is your immortal soul and not your short and transitory life on earth, then it would be seen as worth it.
The Templars gratefully accepted many such gifts of land, which were channeled into productive communities where the brothers in the West lived and worked. It was these communities, called preceptories, that became the bedrock of the Templar network.
I think that the Templars gave a good deal of thought to the best way of exploiting their Western preceptories for the purposes of supporting their military front line. But it's not entirely easy to do this consistently, since by their very nature donations tend to be random. As time went on, they tried quite hard to rationalise their holdings in a way which would make them more effective, and even in some areas to provide preceptories which were rather specialist, perhaps specialist in banking or in stud farms or in providing shipping and so on.
A typical rural preceptory of the Templars usually comprised of farmland centred around a manor house, with any numbers of barns, stables and outhouses, depending on the size and location of the farm. No entire preceptories remain today, but many individual buildings do. These enormous barns were constructed by the Knights Templar more than 800 years ago. The aim of all Templar preceptories was to make money. A third of all income went to the knights on the frontier. Every donation, large or small, was fully exploited for maximum revenue. If they were given unused land, they had it settled and cultivated. New mills, wine presses and ovens were constructed to soak up the extra agricultural produce, and new village and town markets were created. In this way, the economy of an entire region could steadily be boosted. But it also meant that the Templars could take economic control of whole areas as they bought up businesses and land. In the Champagne town of Provins, the Knights Templar would eventually own more than 70 properties. The Templars were always improving their market position, and their dominance caused considerable resentment among both peasants and landholders. To their rivals, the Templars had one particularly unfair advantage. Their holdings were exempt from taxes or tithes.
It was normal for the population, in one form or another, to pay tithes. The Templars were granted an exemption from tithe on the land they acquired, which enabled them to grow perhaps more rapidly than they would have done before. So in that sense, they're not paying the proportion of their income into the church, which you might normally have expected them to have to do. Again, the justification here is that the money is being contributed towards the church, it's being contributed towards the Holy War. I think inevitably, however, when somebody gets a privilege, somebody else objects to the fact that they have a privilege.
Within 30 years of its foundation, the temple was managing farms and urban properties throughout France, England, and much of Europe. They had European headquarters in Paris and London. Many of the Templar properties on the Iberian Peninsula were fortified, as the Muslims retained a strong presence on the Spanish mainland. The Templar network provided security and lodgings all along the main trade routes of Europe, as well as to the Holy Land. Some of their most important offices were at the main Mediterranean ports. The temple was involved in shipping from its earliest days. It had soon extended its role from protecting pilgrims in the East to protecting pilgrims travelling to the East. The order constructed an early travel agency, providing pilgrims with not just security, but transport and accommodation. At first, the order had chartered vessels from the great seafaring cities of Italy, but once again the temple decided to improve its market position. It built its own ships and consolidated its long-distance travel business, an industry it had helped to create in the first place. One of the temple's most important income-generating regions was on the main axis linking the great Mediterranean and northern European trading zones. The Champagne region of France, one of the temple heartlands, was a bridge between North and South Europe. It was here that enormous trade fairs developed, which ushered in the dawn of international business. The great trade fairs of Champagne saw the exchange of goods from all over Europe, which the Templars could not fail to benefit from. The economic boom also triggered a financial revolution, which saw the birth of modern banking. The Templars were well placed to enter the world of banking. They had offices all over Europe, and their continuous state of warfare had given the Templars the experience of handling large sums of money.
One of the reasons why the Templars were effective bankers was that people trusted them. And they trusted them not only because of their integrity, but also because they had the physical means to defend the money which they held. They had castles and they had armed men who could accompany any movement of actual specie if that was required. And they maintained their reputation for paying when required and for honest dealing. And in that sense, therefore, the Templars were successful as bankers. The Templar Bank in Paris performed most of the functions that one would associate with a modern bank. It made loans, you could deposit money there. It actually had an open cash desk, which was open many days of the year, particularly when it was most needed at times when payments were being made at the end of the harvest and so on. It kept separate accounts for people. It was involved in the transfer of currencies. It was involved in investment. So most of the functions you would associate with a modern bank can be seen at least in the Templar banks in Paris and in London, and also in a number of other places as well. They also perhaps went beyond some of the functions of a modern bank, and you could say that they were performing functions you'd associate with a modern accountancy firm, in that they would audit the accounts of the King of France, for instance.
The Templars' unparalleled financial acumen and entrepreneurial drive had brought the warrior monks untold wealth. The order had risen to the very pinnacle of society, and they didn't just work for the French crown. The Templars provided security and financial advice to most of Europe's great rulers, including the King of England and the Pope. But for many observers, there was a difference between what the Templars were supposed to be, poor knights of Christ battling with the infidel, and what they appeared to be, hugely wealthy aristocrats with royal connections. Although a third of all revenue provided by the Templar network was sent to the east, few ordinary people ever saw their Holy Land activities. All most people ever heard about the Crusades was a growing catalogue of defeat and humiliation. The Crusaders had lost the Christian holy sites, which was the primary aim of the Knights Templar. Their frequent setbacks in the Holy Land made many suspicious. How could they justify such riches when they were supposed to be poor knights battling Islam for the love of God alone? For years, medieval chroniclers had suspected that financial motives affected all Templar behavior in the Holy Land. A castle siege